In 1856, Ohio, 3 baby boys were born, but they didn't live like normal children. When one cried, all 3 cried. When one was hurt, the others felt the same pain. Doctors were confused. The town was terrified. And then, one experiment nearly killed all 3 at once. This is a real-life mystery that science still cannot explain. If you enjoy dark, true stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And before the story continues, tell us in the comments, which state are you watching from? In the spring of 1856, the town of Willow Creek, Ohio, was a place where nothing unusual ever happened. It was a quiet farming town with dirt roads, wooden houses, and people who knew each other by name. Life moved slowly. Babies were born, crops were planted, and Sundays were reserved for church. No one in Willow Creek expected history to knock on their door in the form of a single birth that would change the town forever. The mother was a young woman named Margaret Halloway. She lived with her husband, Thomas, in a small farmhouse on the edge of town. They were not wealthy people. Thomas worked long days in the fields, and Margaret took care of the home. When Margaret became pregnant, it brought simple happiness to their lives. The town midwife examined her and told her it was a normal pregnancy. No signs of trouble were seen. No one imagined what was coming. On a cold April night, Margaret went into labor. The pain came suddenly and much stronger than expected. Thomas rushed to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Eliza Crow, a woman who had helped deliver nearly every child in Willow Creek for over 20 years. By the time they returned, Margaret was already weak and shaking. Something felt wrong to Mrs. Crow almost immediately. The labor was longer than usual, and Margaret's cries echoed through the house in a way that made even the strong-hearted midwife uneasy. Hours passed. Then the first child was born, a baby boy, silent at first, then crying loudly. Mrs. Crow cleaned him and wrapped him in cloth, but before she could rest, Margaret screamed again. Another child followed, then another. When the third baby entered the world, the room fell into stunned silence. Triplets were almost unheard of in those days, especially in a small town like Willow Creek. The midwife stood frozen. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. 3 babies lay before them, all boys, all nearly the same size. Margaret was exhausted, barely conscious. Mrs. Crow whispered a prayer under her breath. She had never seen this before, and fear crept into her heart, not just fear for the mother, but fear of what this birth might mean. As dawn broke, word spread quickly. By morning, neighbors gathered outside the farmhouse. People whispered, pointed, and crossed themselves. Some called it a miracle, others called it a bad sign. In 1856, many still believed that unusual births carried messages from God or warnings. When the town doctor, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, arrived later that day, he was shocked. He examined the babies carefully. What troubled him was not that there were 3 of them, but how identical they were. Their faces, their tiny hands, even the small birthmarks near their shoulders were exactly the same. He had seen twins before, but never anything like this. The babies were placed side by side in a wooden cradle. What happened next unsettled everyone in the room. When one baby cried, the other 2 cried at the same time. When one stopped, they all stopped. Their breathing rose and fell together, as if controlled by a single rhythm. Dr. Whitmore watched closely, his brow covered in sweat. He could not explain it. Margaret was told she was lucky to survive the birth. Many women did not. But as she rested, she looked at her children with a strange mix of love and fear. She later told Thomas that when she held one baby, she felt as if she were holding all 3 at once. She could not explain why, but it left her shaken. By the second day, the town was buzzing. Church elders came to pray. Curious townsfolk asked to see the children. Some refused to enter the house, believing the birth was unnatural. Mrs. Crow overheard whispers of curses, of sins carried from the parents' past. One woman claimed she had seen a strange light in the sky the night the babies were born. Another swore she heard 3 voices crying before labor even began. Dr. Whitmore began writing notes. He measured the babies, recorded their heartbeats, and checked their reflexes. Everything appeared normal, yet something felt deeply wrong. When he lightly pressed the finger of one child, the other 2 reacted, flinching at the same time. The room went silent. No one spoke. The doctor's hands trembled. Thomas tried to protect his family from the growing fear, but it was impossible. The town that once felt safe now felt like a place of watching eyes. Children were warned not to go near the Holloway home. Some neighbors stopped bringing food. Others brought it, but refused to step inside. That night, Margaret dreamed of 3 shadows standing at the foot of her bed, breathing as one. She woke up screaming, and when she ran to the cradle, she found the babies awake, staring at the ceiling, their eyes wide and unblinking. None of them were crying. It was as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. By the end of the week, the birth of the triplets had gone from town gossip to town fear. Dr. Whitmore confided in the local priest, asking for guidance. The priest said he had never read of such a case. He advised prayer and silence, but even his voice lacked confidence. Margaret named the boys Daniel, Samuel, and Joseph. She hoped names would make them feel separate, real, human, but even as days passed, she could not tell them apart. No one could. The babies moved together, slept together, and woke together. When one fell ill with a fever, the others followed within hours. The birth that should have brought joy instead planted a seed of dread in Willow Creek. People began to wonder if they were witnessing something that should never have happened. Some believed the town was being tested. Others feared punishment was coming. No one yet knew that this was only the beginning. The triplets' arrival had opened a door, one that science, faith, and reason would all fail to close, and the quiet town of Willow Creek would never be the same. As weeks passed after the birth, the people of Willow Creek hoped the strange feelings would fade. Many believed that once the shock of the triplets' arrival settled, life would return to normal. But instead of becoming ordinary children, the 3 boys grew in a way that made fear deeper and more difficult to ignore. From the very beginning, the triplets behaved as if they were not 3 separate children, but one single being divided into 3 bodies. Margaret noticed it first during feeding. When she held Daniel to her chest, Samuel and Joseph would begin to move and make small sounds at the exact same moment, even though they were lying across the room. If one finished feeding and fell asleep, the other 2 would close their eyes seconds later, as if an invisible signal had been sent. At first, Margaret told herself it was just a coincidence. Mothers often look for patterns where none exist. But the patterns became too perfect to ignore. The boys did not simply resemble each other in face and body. Their movements were mirrored. When one lifted his tiny hand, the others did the same. When one frowned, the others followed. It was like watching reflections in a broken mirror. Thomas tried to remain calm. He reminded Margaret that twins often shared strong bonds, and triplets were rare but not impossible. Still, even he felt uneasy when he stood beside the cradle at night and watched the children breathe. Their chests rose and fell together, perfectly timed, as if they shared a single set of lungs. Dr. Whitmore continued his visits, growing more serious each time. He tested their reactions carefully. He clapped his hands near one baby's ear. All 3 startled. He touched cold metal to one child's foot. All 3 pulled their legs back. The doctor had no explanation. There were no visible nerves connecting them, no physical reason for this shared response. By the time the triplets were 3 months old, their connection seemed to grow stronger instead of weaker. Margaret noticed that when one child cried in pain, the others cried with the same intensity, even if they had not been touched. Once, Samuel accidentally rolled too close to the edge of the bed and bumped his head lightly. The sound was soft, barely enough to cause harm, but within moments, Daniel and Joseph began screaming as if they too had been hurt. No bruises appeared on their heads, but their cries were real and full of distress. The town began watching closely. Neighbors no longer spoke freely around the Holloway home. They whispered behind closed doors. Some claimed the children were cursed. Others said they were blessed in a way humans could not understand. Church sermons began focusing on unity, sin, and punishment, though no names were spoken aloud. Margaret tried to dress the boys differently to help tell them apart. She stitched small colored threads into their clothing, but even with these marks, people struggled. Their faces were too alike. Their expressions changed at the same time. When one smiled, all three smiled. When one stared into space, the others did the same, their eyes focused on nothing anyone else could see. The most disturbing moments happened at night. Margaret would wake suddenly, feeling watched. She would rush to the cradle and find the boys awake, all three staring in the same direction. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and calm. They were not crying. They were not afraid. It was as if they were listening together to a voice only they could hear. As the months passed, the triplets reached milestones together. They rolled over on the same day. They sat up within minutes of each other. They spoke their first word at the same time. The word was not mother or father. It was a soft sound, almost like a breath, spoken in perfect unison. Margaret felt her heart race when she heard it. Dr. Whitmore began to fear that this was no longer just a medical mystery. He wrote letters to doctors in nearby cities, carefully describing what he had seen. Some replied with disbelief. Others warned him to stop, saying such things could bring unwanted attention. One doctor suggested the children should be separated to see if the behavior continued. Dr. Whitmore hesitated. Even the idea felt dangerous. The bond between the triplets was not only emotional or behavioral, it felt physical, though no one could see. When one child became sick with a mild fever, the others followed within hours. When one recovered, the others improved at the same time. It was as if their bodies were sharing the same condition, passing pain and relief back and forth without touch. Thomas noticed changes in the town's behavior. Friends who once greeted him warmly now avoided his eyes. Children were warned not to play near his land. Some neighbors claimed livestock became restless when brought close to the Holloway house. A few said their dogs refused to walk past the property, pulling hard at their leashes and whining. Margaret began to feel trapped. She loved her children deeply, but fear lived beside that love. She worried constantly about what would happen if one of them were seriously injured. Would the others suffer too? Would all three survive? These thoughts haunted her day and night. One afternoon, a visiting cousin from another town came to see the babies. She laughed at first, calling them nature's perfect copies, but her laughter faded quickly. When she picked up Daniel and accidentally pricked her finger on a sewing needle hidden in her dress, Daniel screamed. At the same moment, Samuel and Joseph screamed as well, even though they were asleep. The cousin dropped the child in shock, her face pale. She left the house early and never returned. By the end of the first year, Willow Creek no longer saw the triplets as children. They were spoken of in hushed tones, as if saying too much might invite danger. People believed the children were cursed by something older than science, something beyond human understanding. The triplets themselves seemed calm within their strange unity. They rarely cried unless all three cried together. They rarely laughed unless all three laughed together. They were never truly alone, even when separated by walls. What frightened the adults most was not what they saw, but what they could not explain. 3 children living as one, three minds moving together, three bodies sharing something invisible and powerful. And as the bond between the triplets grew stronger with each passing day, a terrifying question began to form in the minds of those watching them. If one child could feel the pain of the others, what would happen if that pain ever became unbearable? By the second year of the triplets' lives, Dr. Samuel Whitmore could no longer hide his fear behind calm words and polite smiles. At first, he had approached the case with curiosity, believing that time and careful study would bring answers. But as months passed, the questions only grew darker. What he was seeing did not fit into any medical knowledge he possessed. Dr. Whitmore began visiting the Halloway home more often than before. Sometimes he came during the day, sometimes late at night. He carried notebooks filled with careful handwriting, pages stained with ink and worry. Each visit left him more troubled than the last. The triplets were healthy by all normal signs, yet nothing about them felt normal. During one visit, he decided to test something simple. He gently tapped Daniel's knee with a small wooden tool used to check reflexes. Daniel's leg moved, just as expected. But before the doctor could even write it down, Samuel and Joseph's legs moved in the same way at the same time. Dr. Whitmore froze. His hand trembled as he lowered the tool. He tried again, this time touching Joseph's arm lightly. All three children turned their heads toward him together, their eyes locking onto his face. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost pressing against his chest. Margaret watched from the corner, holding her breath. Thomas stood near the door, his fists clenched. The doctor left that day without speaking much. When he returned home, he stayed up all night reading old medical journals and books. He searched for stories of twins, shared nerves, strange births, anything that could explain what he had witnessed. But every page ended in the same place. There was no answer. As weeks went on, Dr. Whitmore's notes changed in tone. At first, they were neat and scientific. Later, the words became rushed, uneven, almost desperate. He began writing not only what he observed, but how it made him feel. He wrote about a sense of unease, about the feeling that something unseen was watching him when he stood near the children. One evening, he noticed something that chilled him deeply. One of the triplets had developed a small rash on his back. It was nothing serious, just a mild irritation, but within a single day, the same rash appeared on the other two in the exact same spot, shaped the same way. No infection could spread that fast or that perfectly. Dr. Whitmore stared at the marks, his mouth dry. He questioned Margaret carefully, asking if the boys slept close enough to touch each other. She shook her head. She had separated them many times, hoping it might weaken their strange bond. But distance did nothing. The connection remained. Dr. Whitmore began to fear that continuing his tests might cause harm. Still, his need to understand pushed him forward. During one visit, he lightly pricked Samuel's finger with a pin, barely enough to draw blood. Samuel cried sharply. Within seconds, Daniel and Joseph screamed as well, clutching their hands, even though their skin was unbroken. Margaret rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, begging the doctor to stop. That night, Dr. Whitmore could not sleep. The cries echoed in his mind. He wondered what would happen if one child suffered a serious injury. Would the others feel it too? Could they survive such shared pain? The thought terrified him. The doctor began to withdraw from town life. He stopped attending social gatherings and avoided long conversations. People noticed the change in him. Whispers followed him through the streets. Some believed he knew more than he was saying. Others claimed he had angered God by meddling in things meant to remain hidden. Dr. Whitmore finally decided to write to a respected medical professor in Cincinnati. He described the triplets in careful detail, choosing his words wisely, afraid of sounding mad. Weeks passed before a reply arrived. When it did, The letter was short and unsettling. The professor suggested that the doctor might be allowing imagination to influence observation. He advised rest and prayer. That response broke something inside Dr. Whitmore. If trained minds refused to even consider the possibility, then the mystery might never be understood. He began to feel alone, trapped between what he knew was real and what the world refused to believe. His fear deepened one rainy afternoon. During a routine visit, one of the triplets slipped from Margaret's arms and fell gently onto the floor. The fall was not hard enough to cause injury, but all three children screamed as if struck by a blow. The doctor checked them carefully. No bruises appeared, yet their cries were filled with real pain. Their heartbeats raced together, pounding fast and wild. The doctor stepped back, his face pale. He felt as if he were standing near something powerful and dangerous, something that could turn against anyone who came too close. For the first time, he wondered if studying the children was wrong. What if observation itself caused harm? At church the following Sunday, Dr. Whitmore sat quietly in the back pew. When the priest spoke of forces beyond human understanding, the doctor felt as if the words were aimed directly at him. He bowed his head, not in prayer, but in confusion and fear. Margaret noticed the change in him. His eyes looked tired, haunted. He spoke less, listened more. When she asked him directly if her children were in danger, he hesitated too long. That pause told her everything. By the end of that year, Dr. Whitmore stopped bringing his tools. He still visited, but now he mostly watched. He observed how the boys played, how they reacted to sound and light, how they leaned toward each other even when separated. His notes grew darker, filled with questions instead of facts. He wrote one sentence over and over in different ways, as if trying to make sense of it. These children are connected in a manner I cannot explain. The doctor's fear was no longer just professional, it was personal. He believed that the triplets were showing him the limits of science, the edge where knowledge ended and something else began. And standing at that edge made him feel small, helpless, and afraid. As the bond between the triplets continued to strengthen, Dr. Whitmore began to realize a terrifying truth. This was not a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a warning, one that might carry a terrible price for anyone who dared to push too far. As the triplets grew older, fear slowly spread through Willow Creek like a sickness no one could cure. At first, people had only whispered behind closed doors. Now those whispers were turning into firm beliefs. The town was no longer just curious about the Halloway children. Many were convinced that something dark surrounded them. Church became the center of these fears. Sermons grew heavier, filled with words about punishment, hidden sins, and signs sent by God. The priest never mentioned the triplets by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Each time he spoke of unnatural bonds or warnings from heaven, eyes quietly turned toward the Halloway family sitting near the back. Margaret felt those eyes every Sunday. She held her children close, her hands shaking slightly. She prayed harder than ever, begging God to protect her sons. But deep inside, fear lived beside her faith. She wondered if the town might be right. She wondered if her children were carrying something dangerous inside them. Rumors began to take shape. Some said Margaret had angered God before marriage. Others claimed Thomas's family carried a curse passed down through generations. A few whispered darker ideas, saying the children were not fully human. These words cut deeply, but the Halloways heard them anyway. In a small town, secrets never stayed hidden for long. Neighbors who once brought bread and soup stopped coming. Children were pulled away if they wandered too close to the farmhouse. When Margaret went to the market, conversations stopped. People stared, then looked away quickly, as if eye contact itself might invite trouble. One afternoon, a group of church elders came to visit the Halloway home. They sat stiffly in wooden chairs, their faces serious. They spoke softly at first, saying they were concerned for the town's spiritual safety. Then one of them suggested that perhaps the children should be baptized again, this time with special prayers. Another suggested days of fasting. None of them offered comfort, only fear. Thomas grew angry. He told them his children were innocent and healthy. He demanded respect. The elders left quietly, but their expressions said everything. They were not convinced. That same week, strange stories began to spread. A farmer claimed his crops near the Halloway land had failed overnight. A woman said her milk spoiled whenever she passed their house. Another swore she heard 3 voices whispering in the dark near the fields. No proof was ever shown, but belief did not need proof. Fear was enough. Margaret started keeping the children inside more often. She closed the curtains and locked the doors. At night she sat awake listening to the sounds of the house, afraid that someone might come. The boys sensed her fear. They clung to each other constantly, their calm expressions never changing, their eyes often focused on nothing. Dr. Whitmore tried to speak against the growing hysteria. He told people the children were not dangerous. He reminded them that fear could create lies. But his own uncertainty weakened his words. People noticed his hesitation, and it only made things worse. If even the doctor was unsure, then surely the danger was real. The priest finally visited the Halloways alone. He spoke kindly at first, offering prayers and blessings. Then he asked a question that chilled Margaret's blood. He asked if she had ever felt that her children were more than human. Margaret did not answer. She could not. Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. The priest sighed deeply, as if her silence confirmed his worst fears. That night, Margaret dreamed of the town church burning, while 3 shadows stood unharmed in the flames. She woke screaming. The triplets were awake too, breathing together, their eyes open and calm. They reached for each other, ignoring her cries, as if they were comforting one another instead. Thomas began to worry not just about fear, but about safety. He overheard men talking near the general store, discussing whether the town should do something before it was too late. Those words followed him home like a threat. He kept a shotgun near the door, something he had never done before. One evening, a stone was thrown through the Halloway window. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. They were no longer welcome. Margaret collapsed to the floor, shaking. The children cried together, their voices filling the house with a sound that felt sharp and painful. The next Sunday, the Halloways did not attend church. This only increased suspicion. People said they were hiding. Others claimed they were ashamed. The priest spoke openly now, warning that evil often thrived in silence. Margaret felt trapped. If she stayed, the town might turn violent. If she left, she would confirm their fears. She prayed constantly, asking for guidance, asking for a sign. None came. Meanwhile, the bond between the triplets seemed untouched by the chaos around them. They played quietly, moving together, sharing looks no one understood. When the town's anger grew loud, the boys grew calm. Their connection felt stronger than ever, almost protective. One cold night, Margaret heard voices outside. Men were arguing in low tones. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding. Words like curse, danger, and God's will floated through the dark. She held her children tightly, tears falling onto their hair. The voices eventually faded, but the fear remained. Margaret realized that the town no longer saw her children as boys. They were symbols now, signs, warnings, and once people decide something is a sign, they stop seeing the human truth beneath it. By the end of that year, Willow Creek had changed. Smiles were gone. Trust was broken. The Halloway family lived under a shadow made not of darkness, but of belief. a belief that something unnatural had entered their town and that it needed to be dealt with. Margaret looked at her sons one night as they slept, their small hands almost touching, their breathing perfectly matched. She loved them more than her own life, but for the first time she wondered if loving them would be enough to keep them safe. The whispers had become judgment. The judgment was turning into action, and the curse the town feared was no longer just a rumor. It was becoming a reason.
The tension that had been growing in Willow Creek finally reached a breaking point on a stormy autumn evening. The sky was dark long before night arrived, and heavy rain fell without pause. Inside the Holloway home, Margaret sat near the fire with the triplets, trying to calm them as thunder rolled across the fields. She felt uneasy all day, as if something terrible was waiting just beyond the walls of the house. Thomas had not yet returned from the barn. He had gone out earlier to secure the animals before the storm worsened. Margaret watched the door constantly, her heart beating fast with every loud crack of thunder. The triplets sat close together on a blanket, unusually quiet, their eyes following the flicker of the firelight in perfect unison. Suddenly, a sharp cry broke the silence. One of the boys, Daniel, had crawled too close to the hearth. Before Margaret could reach him, he slipped and fell forward, his small arm striking the hot edge of the iron fire guard. His scream was piercing, filled with real pain. Margaret rushed forward, pulling him back, her hands shaking as she examined the burn on his arm. But before she could even speak, something far worse happened. Samuel and Joseph, who had not been near the fire at all, began screaming too. Their cries were just as loud, just as desperate. Margaret stared at them in horror. When she pulled back their sleeves, her blood ran cold. Red marks were forming on their arms, in the exact same place as Daniel's burn. Margaret screamed for Thomas. When Thomas burst through the door moments later, rain dripping from his coat, he froze at the sight before him. All three boys were crying, clutching their arms. One was burned by fire. The other two were burned by nothing anyone could see. The smell of singed cloth filled the room. Thomas wrapped the children in blankets and held them close as Margaret sobbed uncontrollably. He sent a neighbor boy running through the storm to fetch Dr. Whitmore. By the time the doctor arrived, soaked and breathless, the boys had quieted, their cries fading together as exhaustion took over. Dr. Whitmore examined Daniel's arm carefully. The burn was real, but not life-threatening. Then he turned to the other two. He lifted their sleeves slowly, already afraid of what he would see. His face went pale. The marks were there, not imagined, not faint, real burns, matching Daniel's exactly. The doctor stepped back, pressing his hand to his mouth. He said nothing for a long moment. The sound of rain against the roof filled the silence. Margaret watched his face, desperate for reassurance. None came. "This should not be possible," Dr. Whitmore finally whispered. He cleaned and wrapped all three arms, working carefully, gently, as if afraid to cause more harm. The boys lay quietly now, their breathing slow and perfectly matched. They did not look frightened. If anything, they looked calm, as though the pain had passed through them together and left them all at once. That night, Dr. Whitmore stayed longer than usual. He spoke softly to Thomas and Margaret, his voice heavy with concern. He admitted what he had never said aloud before. Whatever connected the triplets was real. It was not imagination. It was not coincidence. And it was dangerous. "What happens," Margaret asked through tears, "if one of them is badly hurt?" The doctor did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet and terrifying. "I fear the others may not survive it." Those words settled over the room like a death sentence. By morning, the story had spread through Willow Creek. Someone had seen the doctor arrive in the storm. Someone else had heard the screaming. By noon, people were whispering that the fire itself had touched the children. Fear turned quickly into panic. Some townspeople claimed this was proof at last, proof that the children were cursed, proof that something unnatural walked among them. A few said the fire had tried to cleanse the house and failed. Margaret refused to let anyone inside. She locked the doors and kept the boys close. But she could not stop the fear outside from growing. Groups gathered in the streets, talking in low, urgent voices. Dr. Whitmore was questioned harshly by town leaders. He tried to explain, but his words sounded weak even to himself. That afternoon, the triplets' burns worsened. Daniel's arm blistered, as expected, but so did the others. Samuel developed a fever, and within hours, Joseph and Daniel followed. The doctor returned, his face grim. He worked tirelessly, applying cool cloths, whispering prayers he did not believe in anymore. Margaret watched helplessly as all three children suffered together. When one moaned in pain, the others moaned too. When one slept, they all slept. It was as if pain itself flowed between them, shared and multiplied. As night fell, Samuel's fever spiked dangerously high. Margaret held him, rocking back and forth. Within minutes, Daniel and Joseph's bodies grew hot as well. The doctor wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands shaking. He had never felt so powerless. For a brief moment near dawn, Samuel's breathing slowed dangerously. Margaret cried out, certain she was losing him. At the same time, the others gasped, their chests tightening as if death itself had reached for all three at once. The doctor acted quickly, forcing cool water between their lips, praying desperately. Slowly, Samuel's breathing steadied, and just like that, the others stabilized too. Everyone in the room knew what this meant. One life could pull the others with it. One death could mean three. When the crisis finally passed, exhaustion filled the house. The triplets slept, their small hands nearly touching, their arms bandaged the same way. Margaret sat beside them, her face hollow. Thomas stared at the floor, his jaw tight with fear and anger. Dr. Whitmore spoke softly before leaving. He said the town would never accept this truth. He warned them that people feared what they could not understand, and fear could turn violent. He suggested something unthinkable just weeks earlier: separation. Margaret looked up sharply, horror filling her eyes. "You mean take them from each other?" The doctor nodded slowly. If they remained together, one accident could destroy them all. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the damage was done. The fire had burned more than skin. It had burned away doubt. The town now believed the triplets were dangerous, and the parents now understood the terrible truth. Their children's greatest strength, the bond that held them together, might also be the thing that would kill them. And the question no one wanted to ask was now unavoidable. How do you protect three lives that share the same pain? After the fire incident, nothing in Willow Creek felt the same. The fear that once lived in whispers was now loud and demanding. People no longer questioned whether the triplets were dangerous. In their minds, the answer was already decided. And at the center of that fear stood Dr. Whitmore, carrying a decision that weighed heavily on his soul. For several nights, the doctor could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the three burned arms, identical in pain, identical in healing. He knew now that keeping the children together was a risk no one could ignore. One serious accident could end all three lives at once. As a man of medicine, he felt responsible. As a human being, he felt terrified. He returned to the Holloway home with a plan he never believed he would suggest. Margaret listened in silence as he spoke. Thomas stood near the window, his back stiff, his face hard. "The only way to understand this connection," Dr. Whitmore said carefully, "is to separate them." The words felt cruel the moment they left his mouth. Margaret shook her head immediately. Her arms tightened around the boys. The triplets sensed the tension and pressed closer to each other, their small hands gripping sleeves and blankets. Their eyes moved together, watching the doctor as one. "You're asking me to break them," Margaret whispered. "They don't even know how to be alone." Dr. Whitmore did not argue. He admitted the truth. Separation could be dangerous. It could cause pain. But leaving them together might be worse. If the town turned violent, if another accident happened, there would be no second chance. The decision was not made quickly. For days, Margaret and Thomas argued in low voices late into the night. Thomas feared the town more than anything. He believed that separating the boys might calm the people, might keep their family alive. Margaret feared losing her children to something unseen, something that separation might awaken. In the end, fear decided for them. Dr. Whitmore arranged for the triplets to be placed in 3 different homes, all within a few miles of Willow Creek. He believed distance might weaken the bond. He chose families who were quiet, childless, and respected. None of them knew the full truth. They were told only that the children needed temporary care for medical reasons. The morning of the separation was cold and gray. Margaret dressed the boys slowly, her hands shaking. She kissed each one again and again, as if trying to leave part of herself behind with them. The triplets clung to each other, crying for the first time in a way that was not shared evenly. Their cries rose and fell together, loud and desperate. When the moment came, it felt violent, even though no one used force. Daniel was taken first. As soon as he was carried outside, Samuel and Joseph screamed louder than Margaret had ever heard. Their bodies shook as if something inside them was tearing apart. Daniel screamed too, reaching out, his face red with panic. As the distance between them grew, all 3 children began to weaken. Their cries turned hoarse, their movements slowed. It was as if their strength was being drained away with every step. Dr. Whitmore felt his chest tighten. He had expected distress. He had not expected this. By the time Samuel was taken to the second home, Joseph had gone strangely quiet. His eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing was shallow. Margaret collapsed to the floor, screaming for her son. The doctor rushed to Joseph's side, pressing his ear to the child's chest. The heartbeat was there, but faint. Across town, Daniel began to vomit uncontrollably. The woman holding him panicked, shouting for help. At the same moment, Samuel collapsed in the arms of the man carrying him, his body limp, his skin cold. Panic spread faster than any rumor ever had. Dr. Whitmore ran between homes, his coat flapping behind him, his mind racing. He examined each child in turn. All 3 were suffering the same symptoms, despite being miles apart. Weakness, rapid heartbeat, labored breathing. It was clear now that distance had not weakened the bond, it had wounded it. The doctor ordered the children brought closer together immediately. He believed, with rising horror, that their lives depended on proximity. As wagons rushed back toward the Holloway home, the town watched in stunned silence. People who had demanded separation now backed away, fear replacing certainty. When Daniel was brought back into the house, Joseph stirred. When Samuel arrived minutes later, all 3 began breathing more evenly. Their color slowly returned. The cries faded. It was as if an invisible cord, once stretched too far, had snapped back into place. Margaret held them tightly, sobbing. Thomas stood frozen, his face pale. Dr. Whitmore sank into a chair, his hands trembling. The experiment had failed. Worse than that, it had revealed a terrible truth. The triplets didn't just share pain, they depended on each other to survive. Whatever connected them was not optional, it was essential. That night, Dr. Whitmore wrote the most frightening words of his life in his journal. Separation causes rapid decline. Proximity restores stability. These children may not be able to live apart. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people were terrified, believing the failed separation proved the children were unnatural. Others were shaken into silence. The idea that three lives could be so deeply linked challenged everything they believed about the human body and soul. Margaret refused to consider another attempt. She barred the doors and windows. She told the doctor she would rather face the town's anger than risk her children's lives again. Thomas agreed, though fear still burned in his eyes. But the damage was already done. The triplets were quieter after that day. They clung to each other constantly, as if distance might return without warning. At night they woke suddenly, gasping, then calmed only when all three were touching. Dr. Whitmore began to realize that the question was no longer how to study the triplets. The question was how to protect them. The town had seen them weaken. It had seen them nearly die. Fear, once fed, does not disappear. It grows sharper. And as the bond between the triplets proved unbreakable, another truth became clear. If they could not be separated, then the only way to silence the fear might be to remove them completely. And that thought frightened Dr. Whitmore more than anything he had seen so far.
After the failed separation, a heavy silence fell over Willow Creek. People stopped arguing openly, but that did not mean fear had faded. In many ways, it became worse. The town had seen the triplets nearly die when taken apart, and instead of bringing relief, this knowledge made them seem even more dangerous. If the children could not live apart, then what power held them together? Official records began to change. Birth logs were no longer discussed. Doctor visits were no longer written about openly. Dr. Whitmore noticed that when he asked for supplies or tried to speak with town leaders, conversations ended quickly. Doors closed more often. People avoided his eyes. It was as if Willow Creek had decided, without ever saying it aloud, that the triplets were a mistake best forgotten. Margaret sensed the shift immediately. Neighbors no longer threw stones or shouted warnings. Instead, they pretended the Holloway family did not exist. No one visited. No one spoke their names. This silence felt more threatening than anger. Silence meant decisions were being made somewhere else. The triplets themselves became quieter after the separation attempt. They still moved together, still slept pressed close, but something had changed. At night they woke suddenly, gasping for air, calming only when all three were touching skin to skin. Margaret slept beside them, afraid that if she closed her eyes too long, something would take them away. One evening, Dr. Whitmore arrived unannounced. His face was pale, his voice low. He told Thomas and Margaret that questions had been asked about his journals. Someone had requested to see his notes. He refused, claiming they were private medical records. The request worried him deeply. Knowledge, once shared, could not be controlled. Soon after, strange men began passing through Willow Creek. They claimed to be traveling merchants or scholars, but they asked too many questions. They wanted to know about unusual births, shared pain, children who mirrored one another. Margaret watched them from behind the curtains, her heart pounding. Then, without warning, Dr. Whitmore stopped coming. Days passed, then weeks. Margaret sent Thomas to check on him. The doctor's house was locked. His office was empty. Neighbors said he had left suddenly, called away for urgent work, but no one could say where he had gone. His journals were gone too. The only man who had tried to protect the truth had vanished. After that, everything happened quickly. One morning, two officials arrived at the Holloway home with papers in their hands. They spoke politely, but their words were cold. They claimed the children were unwell and needed special care. They offered no details. Margaret refused to let them inside. Thomas stood in front of the door, his hands shaking. That night, the Holloways packed what little they could. Margaret wrapped the triplets tightly, whispering to them over and over. They did not cry. They watched her face together, calm and alert, as if they understood more than she knew. Before dawn, the family slipped away from Willow Creek. No one saw them leave or if they did, they never spoke of it. By sunrise, the Halloway farmhouse stood empty. Beds were unmade, the fire was cold, the cradle was gone. When townspeople realized the family had vanished, reactions were mixed. Some felt relief, some felt unease, a few felt guilt, but no one went after them. Records from that time are incomplete. Church notes mention the family once more, then never again. Census lists show blank spaces where names should be. Dr. Whitmore's name disappears as well, as if he had never lived there at all. Stories began to replace facts. Some said the triplets died during the night and were buried secretly. Others claimed they were taken by the state, sent to an institution far away. A few whispered that men of science had taken them, eager to study what nature had created. No proof ever surfaced. Years later, travelers passing near Willow Creek reported strange sights. 3 identical figures seen walking along a distant road, 3 children standing in a field, watching silently. These stories were dismissed as imagination, but they never fully stopped. Margaret and Thomas were never officially recorded again. No death certificates, no marriage records, nothing. It was as if the family had been erased. As time passed, Willow Creek tried to forget. New families moved in. The Halloway house was torn down. The land returned to fields. Children grew up hearing half-stories, told in whispers, always ending the same way. We don't talk about that anymore. But forgetting does not mean something never happened. Decades later, a box was found in the attic of an old building scheduled for demolition. Inside were loose papers, badly damaged by time. Among them were pages written in Dr. Whitmore's handwriting. Most were unreadable. One sentence stood out clearly, written again and again. They cannot be separated, and they cannot be destroyed without destroying all 3. No one knew how the box got there. No one knew how long it had been hidden. The discovery was quietly reported, then quietly ignored. The mystery of the triplets ended not with answers, but with silence. A silence so complete that it felt intentional, as if many people, over many years, had agreed that some truths were too dangerous to remember. Yet the question remained, hanging over the history of Willow Creek like a shadow that never fully fades. Did the triplets disappear to protect the town, or did the town erase them to protect itself? And if they were taken, or if they survived somewhere beyond records and memory, one unsettling thought remained. 3 lives so deeply connected could never truly vanish. They could only be hidden. More than 100 years passed, and Willow Creek changed in ways no one from 1856 could have imagined. Dirt roads became paved. Wooden houses were replaced with brick. New families arrived with no memory of the fear that once lived there. To most people, the town's past was simple and ordinary. But some stories never fully disappear. They wait quietly, buried under time, until someone begins to ask questions. In the early 1960s, a young history researcher named Andrew Collins came to Ohio to study unusual medical cases from the 19th century. He was not looking for anything specific. He spent long days in libraries, reading old newspapers, church notes, and forgotten journals. Most of what he found was dull and expected. Then one afternoon he noticed something strange. In the records of Willow Creek, there was a gap. Several names appeared once and then vanished. A family listed in one census did not appear in the next. A local doctor mentioned briefly, then never again. Andrew felt curious. Gaps in records often meant fires, floods, or poor bookkeeping, but this felt different. It felt intentional. He began digging deeper. In the basement of an old courthouse, Andrew found damaged boxes filled with loose papers. Most were unreadable, but among them was a single page that made his hands shake. It described a rare birth, 3 children, identical behavior, shared pain. The page ended abruptly, as if someone had torn the rest away. Andrew searched for the name of the doctor mentioned on the page, Dr. Samuel Whitmore. There was no death record, no grave, no explanation. It was as if he had stepped out of history. As Andrew continued his research, he discovered references to journals that no longer existed. Several sources mentioned medical notes confiscated for public safety. That phrase caught his attention. Confiscated by whom and why? He contacted medical historians and genetic specialists. Most were polite but skeptical. They said identical twins sometimes shared emotional bonds. They said old stories often became exaggerated. But when Andrew described the shared injuries, the synchronized illness, and the failed separation, the conversations grew quiet. One geneticist admitted that even modern science struggled to explain extreme biological connections. Another warned Andrew not to jump to conclusions. Not everything that lacks an answer is supernatural, she said. But Andrew could not ignore the pattern. He traveled to Willow Creek and spoke with elderly residents. Most denied knowing anything. A few changed the subject quickly. One old woman, nearly 90, whispered something before closing her door. "They told us to forget," she said, and most of us did. Late one night, Andrew was shown a small family Bible that had been passed down through generations. Inside, written in faded ink, were 3 names: Daniel, Samuel, Joseph. No dates of death followed. Only a single sentence: gone, but not divided. That line stayed with him. Andrew published a short paper describing the mystery, careful not to make bold claims. He asked questions instead of giving answers. The response was immediate and uncomfortable. Some praised his work, others demanded it be removed. A few warned him quietly that reopening old stories could cause harm. Then something unexpected happened. A retired doctor from another state contacted Andrew privately. He claimed that his grandfather had once worked at a private medical facility in the late 1800s. Among his belongings was a letter describing 3 boys who could not be kept apart with severe consequence. The boys were never named. The letter ended with a chilling sentence. They were relocated for their own protection and for the peace of others. No location was given. No records followed. Modern science tried to explain the story in different ways. Some suggested an extreme neurological condition. Others proposed psychological mirroring. A few argued it was all myth, built from fear and misunderstanding. But no explanation fully fit the details. What science could not answer was the most disturbing part. If the triplets truly shared one life across 3 bodies, what would happen as they grew older? Would they age together? Would one death mean all 3? Or would their bond adapt, changing in ways no one could measure? Andrew never found the final answer. Before he could continue his research, funding disappeared. Access to certain archives was denied. His paper stopped being cited. The mystery slipped back into shadow, just as it had a century earlier. Yet small reports continued to surface. In the early 1900s, 3 identical men were seen working briefly at a traveling fair, never speaking separately. In the 1920s, a hospital recorded 3 patients who shared the same unexplained symptoms and recovered simultaneously, then vanished before discharge. In the 1940s, soldiers reported seeing 3 identical figures walking calmly through a burning town during wartime, untouched by fire. Each story alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. The mystery of the triplets did not end with their disappearance. It simply changed shape. It became a question passed quietly from one generation to the next, a reminder that human knowledge has limits and that some connections exist beyond what tools and tests can measure. Willow Creek today is peaceful. Children play where the Holloway house once stood. No marker remembers what happened there. But sometimes longtime residents say the air feels heavy at night. Sometimes dogs refuse to cross certain fields. Sometimes people report hearing 3 footsteps where only one person stands. Science continues to advance. Genetics, neurology, and psychology have all grown powerful. Yet no discovery has ever fully explained how 3 lives could be so completely intertwined. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. Not that the mystery exists, but that after more than a century, science still cannot say where it ended, or if it ever did.